The ugly COVID-19 virus is now on the other brew dude's house. And so again, we're following protocols. We are following protocols, and hopefully everything works its way out. And by next week, we'll be talking about beers that are quite dark and yet not a stout. So just a preview of that. And I
Wonderful.
have my, I have my wooden nickel. So,
Oh,
we got to keep
tremendous.
that going. So anyway, this has given us some time to think and to contemplate the hobby. I think what has been driving me to think more about it is that a homebrew shop that is near and dear to us, and maybe because of its proximity to where we live, but the Modern Homebrew Emporium in Cambridge, Massachusetts, its final day of being open since 1990, it closed this past Sunday on February 20th. 2022. And it appears that the other locations in Massachusetts are on their way to also closing, per
Yep.
a Boston Globe article. And I thought to myself, well, that's too bad. Who knows the reason? I mean, rents are going through the roof. Who knows what's the real deal? But looking at the comments underneath the article, there are so many different takes on why this is happening. One being that, well, gee, you can get yourself some great beer by walking down the street. There's no need to have all this effort into brewing beer. Like people were home brewing back in the day because they couldn't get good beer, and so that was the only way they could get good beer. So I found like that was kind of funny. And then costs are also a part of it too. That one would be able to buy a kit for a certain amount of money. Even 10 years ago, it was more in a $25 to $30 range. The
Hmm.
exact same kit is now at least $10 to $15 more than that at this point. I don't know, because maybe I was brewing kits, but certainly as my hobby or my experience in the hobby has grown, and maybe because this is where my disposable income goes, I
Yeah.
don't really think too much about the cost. I know that it's going to be more expensive, and I kind of feel like, yeah, I can justify certain costs and I can not justify certain costs, but it's not
Yep.
ones that I'm kind of wringing my hands saying like, gee, I wish, oh, this kit would be so great, but it's $5 more than it was 10 years ago or however, or 5 years ago or whatever it was. So I just found those like comments to be interesting, maybe from people who aren't necessarily home brewers and such. And it just made me feel like, okay, well, is this hobby becoming less popular? Is it waning in the number of people who are into it? Is that something I should be concerned about? And I kind of came to the fact of like, I looked at different things. I looked at like press releases from the AHA where they were boasting, tens of thousands of members, more than they boast now. This was like probably 10 years ago, 2012. Um, and I'm like, well, okay, that's less members, but that's something. But I think to myself, like, well, is there always going to be a core? And are we just losing the people who are just, newcomers who are, just stepping into the water, putting their little toe in there and saying like, I'll give it a try.
Yeah.
And then, it really wasn't for them and they never did it. So I kind of posed this to all of us, because I know the people who watch us probably aren't watching for the good looks, that's for sure, but mostly for the content about the hobby, about like talking about the experience of brewing beer. And maybe it just had me thinking about like, well, what got me into this mess in the first place.
Yeah.
Like I'm like so into this hobby, and like I see things like that, like, oh well, stores are closing and people are saying like, oh, this isn't something that I'm into anymore. So I sort of posed that to you, Mr. Mike, about like, I mean, you're the guy who got me into it in the first place, but like, so what was your start in it? Like, and what keeps you going in all of this? And what's your,
Yeah.
I guess before that, like, what's your reaction overall
Yeah.
to like the closing and then, the state of the state of this
Sure.
particular hobby.
Sure. So the sad thing about that shop in particular closing for me is, it's no secret that I'm a scientist and I work down in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Um, and so I actually drive by that store every day on the way in and on the way out. And it made it extremely convenient for me to be able to say, hey, you know what, I need to pick up some yeast, or I'm just going to run in and quickly buy, during the day, I might formulate a recipe and swing in and get the stuff on my way out of town. And if I was swinging by there, I could send John a text and say, hey, I'm driving by. Do you need something? Sometimes John would have entries to drop off for a competition, and the Modern Homebrew Emporium was a place to drop them off. So he'd give them
Right.
to me because I'm driving by there and I would put them in there. So it saddens me to know that a place that is a brick and mortar place that is so accessible to me, because I drive by it all the time, regardless of what the parking is like on Mass Ave these days. It's a little sad to know that option's gone now. There was another shop that we used to go to too that has moved a little bit further away. It's even more difficult for us to get to. It's not that it's really far away; it's just a pain. So having these guys, the Modern Homebrew Emporium, close their doors is sad. The state of the hobby for me, I'm intrigued because I look at the Brewlosophy does an annual poll of like demographics and stuff like that. The AHA has their polls of demographics. One of the interesting things I was thinking about when you mentioned comments about cost and stuff, right? This hobby is dominated by 40-ish, 35, I'll be fair, 35 plus affluent white males, basically, right? And so if cost is driving people away, well, then we did that to ourselves by buying glycol jacketed 3-gallon stainless steel fermenters with tri-clamp fittings and neoprene jackets and all that stuff. Now, that's not to knock any of that gear. I would love to have a ton of that gear. But it's interesting to wonder if there's a little bit of cause and effect there with the fact that we all love stainless steel, and I remember it was hard to get copper to do a copper wort chiller. Now they're selling stainless steel wort chillers, right? It's like pretty soon we're all going to go titanium, and there'll only be like 6 of us homebrewing, right? So to some extent, our demographic has sort of created a barrier to entry, if that makes sense, right? Possibly. I would love to see a breakdown of people who've been brewing for more than 10 years. How many of those people are still in the hobby from 3 years ago till now, or 5 years ago till now, right? So to get to the point you were sort of making about people dropping off, or do they come in and they make, because it's really hard these days with all the information available, or maybe that's making it harder, but it's hard to envision making poor beer on your first go, especially with all the all-in-one systems. And I'd love to have like an anvil or a grain father or something like that, right? I think to make all grain beer, a simple pale ale right away is probably pretty easy in the hobby. So like quality of the product probably isn't driving people away like it did in the late 90s, early aughts, right? As far as like, oh, I tried this and it's just a yeasty mess, right?
Yeah.
So it'd be interesting to dig into those demographics. I'm sure the AHA has that information and thinks about it all the time. So that bleeds into like when I got started, like why start this hobby in the first place? For me, being a scientist, drinking a lot of light beer per se, when I was in college, I remember having my first dark stout, a Guinness, and it just blew my mind. And I asked myself, why is this? Why is this beer what it is? And why is it so different than the Molson and the Sam Adams? Like, what's the difference between this Molson I'm drinking, Sam Adams, and Guinness? Like, why are these beers so different? So I was curious. So for me, the hobby is founded in curiosity as a scientist, but also a love of the beverage. I was falling in love with craft beer, which also like balances against this idea of, is there too much access to good beer in the marketplace that why would you brew it yourself? I don't know. I think most homebrewers brew beer in spite of that. Like they want to do that. And then, the old adage that people used to brew because you couldn't get good beer, or I'll smooth that out and say you couldn't get like an English pale ale or an English mild or a Belgian whatever, because those things weren't really heavily imported, and that's why people started brewing. Interesting side note, which we have talked about on this channel before too, is that if anything, home brewers are more important now than ever before to keep that going, right? To keep those styles going, which is why we're doing our wooden nickel experiment, just for our own edification and our own enjoyment of the hobby.
Yep.
And so for me, that what got me started was curiosity, but what keeps me in it now is a desire to make great beer, just be better every time I do it, right? And just to have a really good working knowledge of the brewing process, so that when I am out at a new microbrewery or a new brew pub or a new tasting room, and I'm tasting their beers, I can taste them with a real technical, savvy palate and say, this is good or this is not good for me. I'm not going to make that opinion for other people. But a lot of people, John, I'm sure you get this too, and I'm sure our viewers get this too. Like, when you're heavy into beer, there are going to be people in your life who say, hey, try this. Is this good? Or what beer should I get for my barbecue? My great uncle Sal's coming over and he doesn't like such and such. What should I get? And I think it's important as a home brewer to have that skill set of understanding those beer styles and understanding why is an American wheat different than a Hefeweizen, a German wheat, right?
Yeah.
It's a way of being able to educate people too, because I love craft beer. I brew because I love craft beer. Like, I still brew because I love I'm in general, but it really is craft beer. And with the waning amount of choices out there, as I'm sipping on a New England IPA myself, right? But as we're a lack of choices, that's why I still brew. And I brew for the experimentation of it. I'm digging even deeper into the science of it. So that's sort of like my main thing. What about you? I remember when you got started in the hobby and you came to me and said, here's a beer I brewed. I remember that. And it's like, oh boy, here we go.
Yeah.
And it started this great journey. I mean, here we are, what like 18 years later or something. What is it that made you get started, and why are you still doing it?
Well, I think it's the same thing. I think that love of beer, love of like figuring it out, love of experimentation, love of science, love of math, love of just testing things out, love of like taking things apart and putting them back together again, like just understanding and having a deeper understanding start. But I mean, really, it was the community, man. I mean, like, how many times are you like, hey, I'm brewing, want to come over? And I was just kind of fascinated by that process, to the point where I was like, I'm going to try it myself, keep it under wraps and just hand him a bottle and watch his eyes just do this. Like, or like, all right, I brewed this. What do you think? He just kind of like did a double take. You're like, all right, it's on.
Yeah.
It's so on. And I think that's, that part of it, the community part of it, is what still drives me to this day to brew things for the dash, for like, why am I like formulating recipes with, like the same hop variety, but from two different parts of the country, to try to see if like what the differences are. Are those all things that I would do if I were just home brewing for like my neighborhood? Absolutely not. So, I mean, I think part of it is the people that you meet. And I think that, emailing people, like texting, like, talking to people over Facebook Messenger, all the things that we've gone through just, since we started the blog in 2007 through now, we've met so many people who were just cool. Like, we didn't know who they are. They're, if you were to pass them on the street, you wouldn't know who they were, but they are, brew dudes just like us. And they were, they wanted to be a part of it, just like we want to be a part of it. And that's why, like, I always thought the beer people were the best people ever. They were always like pretty chill and, open to sharing ideas and talking about it and just trying to figure it all out, just like we were. And so
I think some of that was our transition from straight blogging to doing the videos too, right?
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
To just increase our own ability to interact with other people and just see what other people had to say about things that we were thinking.
Totally. So, and I think that's what keeps me going too, is like there's that action that I don't think that I would have, if I were just brewing it for myself.
Yeah.
But even so, like I think that if you were to, go to a homebrew club meeting, you'd find people, like-minded people just like yourself, and have great connections and a good time, and meet some great people along the way. So I mean, overall, it's kind of a bummer to see trend lines go like this and to see stores closing. But to me, I'm also thinking to myself, like, things come in waves, and it's all a big cycle.
Yeah.
And we might be on a downward trend right now, but that's not to say that things are coming back. The pendulum swings one direction, then swings back in the other,
Yeah.
just because like the populace is getting into alka pops, or hard seltzers, because I want to watch for carbs. But that trend will also die down too. It's
Yeah.
one of those things where that might be where tastes are going, and it's just easy. Now you were talking to me about your thought about liquor too. Is that something that that's becoming more popular? So does that take attention away from beer and beer brewing?
Yeah. It's interesting, right? Because craft beer itself, volume wise, still represents a small fraction
Yeah.
of the total beer consumed, at least in this country, right? Um, but yeah, no. So like, I love your take on the cyclical nature of it too, right? Like, remember it was maybe 10 years ago, cider tried to have its day. It sort of crept out a little bit out of the shadows, but just couldn't win out over beer. Cider's still very popular. It's been gaining popularity, but it's sort of like in the shadows. Seltzer sort of screamed onto the scene because seltzer's right up the alley of like what some of the mega breweries can produce in high volume, dirt cheap. They've got access to all that artificial flavoring, regardless of how natural they want to call it. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just a reality, and people are drifting towards that. The carb thing is a good point there. But yeah, I think also in the trend is that whiskey in general, craft beer has also led to a renaissance in craft distilling in this country, right? So I love we with some of our friends, we have hit several craft distilleries, and we love that stuff, right?
Mhm.
So going into a craft distillery and having gin and a vodka like product and whatever other weird stuff they can put together while they're aging whiskey, right? It has just sort of has to compete with that market share somewhere. And there's a ton of high volume distilleries out there, but it's those craft distilleries that are probably cutting into that marketplace too. And liquor is more expensive than beer. And I wonder too, in terms of people's budget for certain things, maybe it wins out, because you're certainly not in this country very easily going to make whiskey at home like you can beer. And so if you really start to get the flavor for whiskey, exploring bourbon and rye and everything else in that category, that might take away from some of your budget to brew too. I don't know. It's
Yeah.
certainly maybe some of your time if you're heading out to all those distilleries, right?
Yeah.
So
It is interesting that one of the big online homebrew retailer was sent me an email that had a bunch of sales on malt that is made specifically for
or
distilling.
yeah,
And I thought to myself, isn't that interesting?
yeah.
So are they picking up on that wave? I don't
If
know.
the federal government ever decided to relax the rules about distilling and let the general public start distilling more freely, then maybe you would really see. I don't know. I mean, maybe home brewing would see, at least the homebrew shops would see a resurgence, because they would start selling more stainless steel. But
Yeah.
you could sell more products geared towards distilling. That might help the stores out. But I wonder if craft beer as a market sector and home brewing beer as a sector would take a hit if people started to, right? So
Can you make a
interesting.
still out of titanium is the
Yeah,
question.
titanium still, absolutely. Somewhere a Scotsman is rolling over in his grave as we talk about
Oh,
titanium stills.
how dare we?
How
Yes,
dare
agreed.
we?
So, all right. Well, thanks for watching. I appreciate you taking part in a viewer way of this conversation. I think that these things come up and it makes you wonder why you still give a crap about it. But I think that deep down, maybe there is just a core group of people who are going to brew beers no matter what. They have their own reason. It's not because it's trendy and cool. It's because there is some deeper feeling or deeper meaning towards why they do what they do. And if you're part of those keeper of the flames, especially like as Mike has put it, if it weren't for homebrewers, would some of these styles still be around? I mean, this one had its day too, and it kind of flamed out. It's almost like I've read some articles, and we'll talk about it when we do our wooden nickel recaps of Q1 of 2022. But just to see the rise and fall of black IPA is just a wacky trend that has come and gone, and maybe coming back again because people are saying like, gee, I really do wish they had those bitter IPAs and they don't taste all like fruit punch anymore. So again, secular nature of
Yep.
taste, secular nature of beer, and who knows, probably we'll be talking 10 years ago and like, I can't believe how many people are home brewing yet again. So what we'd like to do is, if you have comments, your own thoughts, what keeps you into the hobby, leave them in the comments below here on our YouTube channel or post here. Like the video if you like it, subscribe to our channel, because no matter what, we do this each and every week. Hopefully next time you see us, we'll be talking about beer and doing the tasting of our jar of destiny beers, along with some other awesome homebrew content. For John and Mike, brew-dudes.com, brew on.
Cheers.